By the fall of 1918, the German war effort was collapsing. On the Western Front, German forces were being pushed steadily backward by a combination of Allied offensives and a massive influx of fresh American troops. On the home front, starvation, inflation, political turmoil, and war weariness were pulling the German Empire apart. In late 1918, General Paul von Hindenburg, commander-in-chief of the German armies, effectively took control of the German government after sidelining Kaiser Wilhelm II. By November, the German royal family had fled the country. A new German republic, later known as the Weimar Republic, had been proclaimed, and Germany had requested a ceasefire. The Allied powers, however, would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. An armistice, or temporary halt to the fighting, was signed and took effect at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the famous 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. At last, the guns of World War I fell silent. Despite the end of the war, many Germans were shocked and resentful. Because Germany had not been invaded, some soldiers believed they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had instead been betrayed by politicians at home. This belief later developed into the dangerous stab-in-the-back myth, which extremist groups would exploit in the years that followed. Once the fighting ended, Europe faced the immense challenge of negotiating a lasting peace. In 1919, the leaders of the major Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, gathered at the Palace of Versailles near Paris to determine the terms of the post-war settlement. Europe had been devastated by 4 years of conflict, and the governments of France and Britain were primarily concerned with securing vengeance against Germany, punishing those they held responsible for the war, and ensuring their own future security. Neither nation was willing to accept any share of responsibility for the conflict, and self-interest largely guided the negotiations. The decisions reached at the Versailles Peace Conference would have far-reaching consequences, shaping international relations for decades and ultimately contributing to the conditions that led to the outbreak of the Second World War. President Woodrow Wilson arrived at the peace conference with a vision that differed sharply from that of the European allies. An idealist, some would argue an overly optimistic one, Wilson believed that the causes of World War I lay in imperialism, secret diplomacy, and militarism. He hoped to create a new international order based on democratic principles and cooperation that would prevent future wars. Even before the peace negotiations began, he presented his famous 14 points, a plan for a fair and lasting peace. Among its key proposals were reductions in armaments, an end to secret treaties, the principle of national self-determination for colonies and subject peoples, and the creation of a League of Nations to provide a peaceful forum for resolving international disputes. Wilson envisioned these measures as the foundation of a more stable and just world. However, he quickly discovered that Britain and France had very different priorities, focusing less on idealistic reform and more on punishing Germany and protecting their own national interests. German representatives arrived in Paris expecting to take part in negotiations over the peace settlement. Instead, they found that they would have no voice in the process at all. The German delegation was confined to its hotel, surrounded by guards and barbed wire, and excluded from the discussions that shaped the future of Europe. When the Allies finished their work, the Germans were simply presented with a completed treaty and given no opportunity to revise its terms. They were told bluntly that they must sign the agreement or face an Allied invasion of Germany. This treatment was intended to demonstrate Germany's defeat and reinforce Allied authority, but the humiliation it created fueled bitterness and resentment throughout Germany. Those feelings would have lasting consequences, undermining support for the new democratic government and contributing to political instability in the years that followed. The final Treaty of Versailles placed full responsibility for the war on Germany through the infamous war guilt clause and imposed a series of harsh penalties designed to weaken the defeated nation. One of the most significant consequences was the loss of German territory. Alsace-Lorraine, a region that Germany had controlled since 1871, was returned to France, while Germany's overseas colonies were taken over by Britain and France as mandates. In addition, the Rhineland, an important industrial region along Germany's western border, was occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. Even after the occupation ended, Germany was permanently prohibited from stationing military forces in the Rhineland. These territorial losses reduced Germany's power, damaged its economy, and created widespread resentment among many Germans. who viewed the treaty as both unjust and humiliating. The Treaty of Versailles also imposed severe military restrictions on Germany in an effort to prevent it from ever threatening Europe again. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men, and Germany was forbidden from possessing tanks, military aircraft, or submarines. Its navy was reduced to only 6 ships, and even civilian sectors felt the impact, as portions of the German fishing fleet were restricted. These measures were intended to strip Germany of its ability to wage modern warfare and ensure that it could not rebuild a powerful military force. To appreciate the scale of these restrictions, consider that Germany, a nation nearly the size of Texas and home to millions of people, was permitted an army roughly comparable in size to the population of modern-day Wichita Falls, Texas. Many Germans viewed these limitations as deeply humiliating, further fueling resentment toward the treaty and the governments that enforced it. The treaty also required Germany to pay reparations or financial compensation for the damage caused by the war. Unlike many previous peace settlements, the Treaty of Versailles set no upper limit on what Germany might ultimately be required to pay. The Allied powers retained the authority to determine the amount and duration of these payments, allowing them to demand reparations for as long as they deemed necessary. Many Germans viewed this open-ended obligation as both unfair and impossible to meet. The burden of reparations placed enormous strain on Germany's economy, contributing to financial instability, inflation, and widespread economic hardship during the post-war years. For many Germans, the reparations issue became one of the most hated aspects of the treaty and a powerful symbol of the humiliation imposed by the victors of World War I. Despite its harsh terms, the Treaty of Versailles did include a few constructive measures. One important achievement was the restoration of Poland as an independent nation, ending more than a century of partition and foreign rule. The treaty also established the League of Nations, an international organization intended to promote cooperation among countries and provide a peaceful means of resolving disputes before they led to war. However, these accomplishments were undermined by significant weaknesses. Germany, one of Europe's most important nations, was initially excluded from League membership, while the United States, whose president had championed the organization, ultimately refused to join. Without American participation, the League lacked the influence and power needed to enforce its decisions effectively. As a result, the organization struggled to maintain international peace, limiting its ability to prevent future conflicts during the turbulent years that followed World War I. The treaty's economic demands contributed to a severe financial crisis in post-war Germany. Struggling to meet its reparations obligations and facing mounting economic pressures, the German government began printing money on a massive scale. This policy triggered one of the most catastrophic episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. The value of the German mark collapsed at an astonishing rate. A loaf of bread that had cost 63 pfennigs in 1918 rose to 250 million marks by January 1923, and then to 1.5 trillion marks by September 1923. By late 1923, German currency had become virtually worthless. At the height of the crisis, $1 was worth more than 4.2 trillion German marks. Ordinary families often needed wheelbarrows filled with banknotes just to purchase basic necessities such as food. Those living on fixed incomes, especially retirees and members of the middle class who had spent years building savings, saw their financial security disappear. The economic chaos deepened public frustration with the Weimar Republic and fueled political extremism. Eventually, Germany ceased making reparations payments altogether, setting the stage for further international tensions and economic disputes during the 1920s. When Germany defaulted on its reparations payments, the economic and political crisis deepened further. Britain and France, both heavily indebted to the United States because of wartime loans, argued that they could not repay their own debts unless Germany continued making reparations payments to them. In response to Germany's failure to pay, France sent troops into the Ruhr Valley in 1923, Germany's most important industrial region, to seize coal, iron, and other resources directly as compensation. Rather than solving the problem, the occupation intensified Germany's economic turmoil and fueled nationalist resentment. Although international efforts such as the Dawes Plan, 1924, and the Young Plan, 1929, later sought to stabilize the German economy and restructure reparations payments. Much of the damage had already been done. The combined effects of the Treaty of Versailles, the humiliation of military defeat, foreign occupation, and devastating economic hardship undermined faith in Germany's democratic government. These conditions created fertile ground for extremist political movements, which promised to restore national pride, rebuild economic prosperity, and overturn the post-war settlement. The Treaty of Versailles provided a powerful source of resentment that Adolf Hitler and other extremist leaders would later exploit for political gain. As a young political agitator on the fringes of German politics, Hitler repeatedly appealed to widespread grievances over the post-war settlement. He claimed that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians and other supposed traitors, argued that the Treaty of Versailles was unjust and humiliating, and insisted that the German nation had been unfairly punished by the victorious Allies. These messages resonated with many Germans who were struggling with economic hardship, political instability, and a sense of national humiliation. Through skillful propaganda, Hitler transformed these frustrations into support for the Nazi movement. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the combined effects of economic crisis and political turmoil enabled him to rise from relative obscurity to become one of Germany's most influential political figures. In this sense, many historians view the Treaty of Versailles as an important factor in creating the conditions that contributed to the rise of Nazism and ultimately to the outbreak of World War II.